what's going on, everybody? It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and Throne of Eldraine is coming out this following week, so it's time to go ahead and do our limited set review. We'll be looking at every single card in each individual color, one video per color, starting off with white and going in Wooburg order, and we'll be kind of shifting all the cards into categories and kind of giving my initial take on the cards. Obviously, I have not played the set. I don't really know where these cards are going to end up, but these are my initial takes on the cards and their individual power levels. So if you've not joined us for a review before, we'll go ahead and start off with the weakest cards and work our way up to what I consider to be the strongest cards. And if you have any comments about them, or if I missed anything, or if you think a card is going to perform better or worse than how I'm saying in the video, feel free to chime in below in the comments. You can also find me on Twitter at MTG_ManaRock. So without wasting any more time, let's go ahead and jump right on in because we got a lot of cards to talk about. I like to start off with what I'm going to start calling the sideline cards. These are build-around cards that either require a specific type of deck to work and you just don't include them if you don't have the right cards to make them tick, or these are sideboard cards which you also don't include in the main board, but when they come in out of the sideboard, they tend to do a pretty good job. They're just not cards that you tend to put in your deck unless you've seen something that they interact with. So, first card here is True Love's Kiss. 2 white for an instant. It's a common, and it says exile target artifact or enchantment, draw a card. That's an okay naturalize effect. The exile is quite nice. Not that there's a lot of recursion for artifacts or enchantments in the set, but the fact that you can snipe maybe your opponent's game-winning enchantment or something like that, and also cantrip is decent. It's not a particularly strong rate. 4 mana is still a lot to usually deal with something that's not exactly killing you directly, but there's some good build-arounds. There are some really bomby, mythic, rare artifacts in this set, so True Love's Kiss will be a decent sideboard card. Just, I don't think we're going to be main deck and naturalizes in this set. It's worth noting that Blue-White's theme in this set is artifacts and enchantments, so True Love's Kiss is going to be pretty good against them. But again, I'll have to wait and see if this is the type of set where you main deck your naturalize effects or if you just board them in. And when you board in True Love's Kiss, it's going to be just fine. Fortifying Provisions, again, this is going to stand out kind of as a testament to me not knowing how this format's exactly going to play out, but let's read the card first. Fortifying Provisions, 2 and a white for a common enchantment. Your creatures get +0/+1. Now, if that was all this did, I would just say it's completely unplayable because that's not worth a card. Given your slight toughness boost, the least amount of toughness that you can possibly give your creatures to make this a relevant card, it just doesn't really shift combat that much unless you're given power as well. It has a little bit of a bonus. When it enters the battlefield, you create a food token, and I believe there's food in every color. I might be wrong about that, but let's just read it once here. We'll read it probably once per video, and then you'll understand what food is. Whenever you create a food token, you're making an artifact token that you can tap and pay 2 mana to sacrifice, and you gain 3 life. There are also other cards, which we'll see a lot in green and black in particular, that can use food tokens for extra effects, but the food on their own doesn't do anything other than sacrifice to gain life, which does mean that the format's going to go a little bit longer. I expect there to be this to not be a particularly fast format, especially if there's a lot of food floating around, because people are just going to have extra life tacked on to some of their cards. Back to this card, Fortifying Provisions. I don't think this does enough. White doesn't really have any particularly useful way to use food. There's 2, maybe 3 cards in white that make food, but unlike green and black, there's nothing that really takes advantage of you having food. So this is the type of card you include in a green or black deck if you're white-green or white-black or something like that, and you have payoffs for having food in those colors, and even then I don't think this card's that good. The onboard effect is not that great. Being an enchantment matters a little bit for blue-white. This just seems kind of weak as a standalone card. It's supposed to bridge a gap between a bunch of different archetypes, but only if your other color, your non-white color, needs either of these effects. So I don't think I'm going to be starting this card. Prove me wrong. If the +0/+1 turns out to be relevant in this format, then I'll go ahead and eat my words, but I don't think this really does very much on its own. Beloved Princess is next. It's a single white mana. It's a 1/1 common human noble. It has lifelink, and it can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater. I think this card is terrible. It will remain to be seen if 1/1s in this format are playable. This is not a knight, so it doesn't really have the tribal synergies. It can pick up maybe an aura or equipment, which there's a decent amount of, but it doesn't do basically anything relevant on its own. It gets in there for damage early on, and people love playing cards like this. I keep thinking of Banehound, the 1/1 lifelink haste creature from War of the Spark. People love playing that card, but it really just falls off super quickly. Beloved Princess has a tiny bonus that it's always relevant against other aggressive decks because they're going to have small creatures, so the princess can keep getting in there, but it really doesn't represent that much of a threat. You can kind of leave this card alone and just go over the top of it very quickly, and then sometimes you stick a 4/4 or a 5/5 or something like that, and suddenly the princess can't even attack anymore. So I'm not starting off with this card unless I see an extremely aggressive deck that just needs anything that can deal damage, and I think you can do a lot better. There are some decent 2-drops in this set, most of which I think are going to be better than Beloved Princess. Deafening Silence, definitely not a limited card here. It's a single white mana for an uncommon enchantment. Each player can't cast more than one non-creature spell each turn. Non-creature spell. This doesn't matter. This is completely unplayable and limited. There's basically 0 situations where you want a card like this. The fact that it's non-creature means that it doesn't even hose a lot of decks that can cast multiple spells in the same turn, since a lot of times you'll just be casting a bunch of creatures in the same turn. This is meant for constructed. Think Rule of Law from M19, just not a playable card, and this is actually probably a decent amount worse than Rule of Law. All That Glitters. This is, I should mention, a little more towards the build-around aspect than it is the unplayable aspect. It's 1 and a white for an aura. It's an uncommon. It enchants a creature, and it says that creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment you control. So note that at its very minimum, this is going to give +1/+1 because it counts itself, and then it's going to give an additional +1/+1 for each aura and enchantment, or not aura, artifact or enchantment you control. So again, kind of harkening to the blue-white theme of having a bunch of artifacts or enchantments in your deck. This card could actually be quite amazing in some decks. If you have a ton of artifacts and a ton of enchantments, this could be 2 mana to give +4, +5, +6, +6, or something along those lines. And it's uncommon for a reason, right? You can't stack a ton of these on top and just decimate your opponent. But sometimes cards like this get there, especially since they can give such huge bonuses. On its own, it's not good. It would be completely unplayable if this was just an aura that gave +1/+1. Even +2/+2 I don't think is enough. I think you have to get to, at minimum, +3/+3, and you have to be able to do that reliably. So you definitely need a deck that's going to be just chock full of artifacts or enchantments, and you need evasive creatures to put this on as well. Putting this on just a chunky creature and attacking doesn't seem that exciting. Sure, put this on your Beloved Princess. I guess that's a strategy. So yeah, this one's a little bit all in. It's kind of like Ethereal Armor, is that what it's called? From Gatecrash, Return to Ravnica. Basically the same idea, but requires a lot of setup. So it sits on the sideline for now. I don't know how prevalent it's going to be that you get decks that just have 7, 8, 9, 10 artifacts or enchantments, but if that ends up being the case, then All That Glitters is going to be a very strong card, especially if you can stick it on a flyer or an evasive creature, but as it stands, not super exciting. Happily Ever After. I'm going to be honest, I didn't even fully read this card, but you've got a 2 and a white enchantment, 3 mana for a rare enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you gain, or I'm sorry, each player gains 5 life and draws a card. So thank you, opponent, you get up a card on me. At the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 5 color, I'm not even going to bother reading this. This is not a playable card in Limited. Sure, you might be able to concoct some sort of deck where this can win. Sure, it's an enchantment. Sure, it cantrips, but it actually puts your opponent up a card too and uses your mana while giving your opponent some extra life in a card. So I'm just not really excited. You need a very kind of all-in nonsense deck in order for this to even be an achievable win con. And even then, it's kind of hard to get there. So I'm saying stay away from this card. If the format goes stale later on, or if you want to try out something goofy, then sure, you can first pick Happily Ever After, and it'll be interesting. But I don't think it's a win-in strategy most of the time. All right, so moving into our next category. These are filler cards. These aren't cards you necessarily want in your deck. You're looking for a reason to cut them. You don't take them very highly in the pack when you're drafting, but they end up making a cut. a decent amount of the time. Starting off with Shining Armor. This is 1 and a white for an equipment, artifact equipment. It has flash, and when it enters the battlefield, you attach it to a knight you control. So you kind of get the auto-equip on the first knight if you already have a knight out, right? This only triggers if you have a knight out and you're casting the armor, not the other way around. The equipped creature gets +0, +2, and vigilance. So that's the effect you're getting. 2 extra toughness, vigilance. That does make you a pretty decent blocker, a pretty decent attacker. On the right kind of creature, this could be good, but I don't think overall you really want this effect. The re-equip cost for 3 is not that great. Using this as a combat trick isn't that great either, since it doesn't pump your power. But the knights tend to be a little bit on the frail side, so 2 extra toughness does mean you'll often at least save your creature in combat, and you can move it around and stuff like that. This is just kind of a tricksy card, but I don't think the payoff is really there. If you absolutely need equipment in your deck or artifacts, then yeah, this is going to get the job done, but I think you could do better. Silver Flame Squire up next, 1 and a white for a 2/1, and this is our first instance of the adventure mechanic, which we'll go over again on the first card, and then you'll kind of have a basis for how it works. So adventure creatures have 2 halves. They have a creature half, which you see on the right. You can cast this for 1 and a white, and you get a 2/1 with some flavor text, and that's it. Or you can cast the adventure half for the adventure cost. So in this case, the adventure half is on alert, which is 2 and a white for an instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Untap it. Pretty weak, pretty expensive combat trick. But the cool thing about adventures is if you cast the adventure half, the card gets exiled, and then you can cast it from exile as the creature half. It doesn't work the other way around. If you just cast it as a creature from your hand, then the adventure is null and void. You don't get to use that anymore. But if you do cast it as an adventure first, you then get to cast it out of exile from a creature, and there are, or as a creature. And there are effects in this set that care about you casting adventures and stuff like that. Overall, this effect is not great. It's flexible, right? You can either have a 2-mana 2/1, or you can have a combat trick that can later become a 2-mana 2/1, although both of those halves don't exactly add up to be an amazing card. It's just flexibility that makes it playable, right? A bear is fine. You can cast a bear. If you really need to be an aggressive deck, you can use Silver Flame Squire. And aggressive decks don't mind the combat trick every now and then. I just think this combat trick in particular is not that exciting. The untap part, you can ambush things, but I find it hard to believe that your super aggro deck doesn't just want the 2/1 on board immediately, rather than trying to hold up some sort of combat trick and then getting the 2/1 later on. Obviously, if you get to 5 mana, 6 mana, and you top deck this, it gives you a little bit more flexibility with what you can do, because you can attack first and use it as a combat trick, and then cast it immediately as a creature later that turn. So that's nice, but if you're holding this on turn 2 and you don't have any other 2-drop, you should probably just play it as a creature. Silver Flame Ritual is up next. This also has a new mechanic, Adamant, which if you pay 3 of the same type of mana, specific type of mana, you get some sort of benefit on your Adamant cards. In this case, you're paying 3 and a white for a common sorcery to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Sure, that can be pretty good. Sometimes that's actually really bad. If you're just trading resources with your opponent, you have 1 or 2 creatures on board, that's not that good, right? But if you have 5 or 6 creatures on board, this becomes actually quite good. The Adamant bonus here, if you paid 3 or more white mana to cast the spell, your creatures gain vigilance. Not really a benefit that's going to sway the way I feel about this card, and I don't feel very highly about it. The fact that you have to have a bunch of creatures for this to actually be really good kind of puts me down on it, although there are some board states where it'll be quite fine. You do, if you're playing this sort of card, you do want to prioritize effects on creatures that make multiple bodies, which we'll see a couple of in white. But for the most part, this is not really the mass pump effect that you're looking for to push in a bunch of smaller creatures. Next up is Outflank. It's a single white mana for an instant, a common, and it deals damage to target attacking or blocking creature equal to the number of creatures you control. So kind of fine that it costs 1 mana, right? Because you don't expect to get a lot out of this. Sometimes you'll deal 2 to 3 damage to a small creature that's attacking in or blocking, and you'll get it out of the way, right? Kind of like a Slash of Talons or an Impeccable Timing, or one of those weaker effects that, white gets to deal with combat. But overall, This card's not great because sometimes you only have one or two creatures and you're getting attacked by, I don't know, a 3/4 flyer or something like that in the air, and you just can't outflank it, right? Outflank is sometimes a dead card in your hand. There are times where you have 5 or 6 creatures on board and you can just use this to Swords to Plowshare as a creature essentially, but only if it's in combat, right? It doesn't even deal with utility creatures that well. So while I'm not super high on this card, I do think you'll probably play a copy or two in your white decks, whether you're playing aggressively or defensively, since it can be used on attacking or blocking creatures, but I don't think this is a premium removal spell by any means, just probably one that you're okay putting in your deck. Knight of the Keep. Oh, God. It's 2 and a white for a 3/2 common human knight, and that's it. It has flavor text. I think the 3 mana 3/2 with no abilities is kind of the definition of a virtually unplayable card. It just never makes the cut nowadays, but this one gets a little bit of an edge because it's a knight, and knights matter in this set. With that being said, though, 3 mana 3/2s are just never that good anymore. They trade down for 2/2s way, way, way too often, and they're just better cards that you can cast for 2 or 3 mana. So I'm not super high on it. If you need a knight in your deck, this will do the job, but it's not the knight I'm looking for. All right, and that leads us into Righteousness. 1 white mana for an instant. It's an uncommon, and target blocking creature gets +7/+7 until end of turn. I think this is a reprint of a rare from a while back. I don't know the last time Righteousness was reprinted, but this just seems kind of worse than Outflank to me, and it's higher rarity. Sure, it's kind of like destroy target attacking creature, but only if you have a creature that can block it, and I guess that's pretty good. +7/+7 could also be quite nice on a lifelinker if you're blocking with a lifelinker, but again, situational, right? What if you're getting attacked by a flyer and you don't have flying creatures? This is not the combat trick or the removal spell that you want. You need to be able to set up a block on a creature, and you're also in white, which means that you're attacking a lot too, and you have to keep a creature back on defense. So I think Righteousness will get the job done. I think if you can pick one up, even though you shouldn't pick it super highly, that you'll probably include one in your deck, similar to Outflank, right? You don't just want a bunch of these. You don't feel like, yeah, I did it whenever you get a bunch of Righteousnesses or Outflanks. It's just not super powerful, but it's going to get the job done. This will usually take out an attacker, so I'm going to give it a nod a little bit in favor of saying, yes, you should play this card, but I think you can do better as far as removal goes. Next up is Hushbringer, 1 and a white for a 1/2 flying lifelinker. It's a fairy, it's a rare. So let's evaluate that. 1/2 lifelink and flyer for 2. Not super crazy, right? That's a playable card. It does chip tiny little bits of damage in at the opponent. It's evasive. It picks up auras and equipment just fine, and it gains you a little bit of life on the backswing as well. It also has a bonus of your all creatures entering the battlefield do not cause abilities to trigger. So no death triggers and no ETB triggers off of creatures. Kind of a little bit of a irrelevant upside for a lot of games. There are some times where your opponent will be holding on to a sweet ETB creature and it just won't do anything because Hushbringer is on board. Same thing when a creature dies, but this affects you too, and it'll probably affect you about the same amount of times as it affects the opponent. It's not like there's an overabundance of ETB effects or death triggers in this set. There certainly are some floating around. Things like when X enters the battlefield, draw a card, or make a food, or when something dies, make a food. So sure, Hushbringer is going to have an effect on some percentage of the cards, but the body itself is not negligible, but not great either. So I don't think this is a rare that you're going to be first picking that often. I'd rather just have a solid removal spell or a good green creature that can beat down or something along those lines rather than a situational flyer, even though if I do end up in a deck that has things like all that glitters and good equipment, good auras, then sure, Hushbringer seems like a fine addition to that deck. And that moves us into the next category. This is usually where most of the cards within a set end up. The solid playables. These are cards that, you're going to fill up most of your draft deck with. You're kind of happy to play them. They're not bombs. They're not going to swing the game wildly or anything like that, but they are going to make up the majority of what your deck is going to end up being, and you'll pick them up basically the early to middle of the pack. First one here is Youthful Knight. This is a reprint. It's 1 and a white for a 2/1 common human knight, and it has first strike. Just a good evasive early creature with a relevant creature type. This is just a solid card. If you're playing an aggressive deck or you're looking for knights, this is the type of card that you're very happy to pick up, even though it does drop off against certain types of decks. If your opponent's playing 3/3s and 4/4s and big monsters, then Youthful Knight's not going to look as good. But against a mirror match with smaller creatures, more combat focused early in the game, Youthful Knight is going to get its damage in, and it can play defense just as well. Prized Griffin up next. This is a very unexciting card, but a tried and true one. It's 4 and a white for a 3/4 flyer. It's a common, it's a Griffin. That's it. Just kind of your run-of-the-mill common flyer, kind of your end of your curve in an aggressive white deck. We saw this card recently with Enforcer Griffin in War of the Spark, and I think Enforcer Griffin was probably even better because it could pressure the Planeswalkers in that set, but Prized Griffin is going to be fine, right? If you need some sort of thing to top your curve, if you're playing aggressively, if you're just looking to kind of control the board and get an evasive creature in there, then Prized Griffin's going to be good at doing all of these things, but I don't think it's ever going to be exceptional, and it's not exactly the finisher you're looking for, just one that you pick up when you don't have a lot of other good ways to close out a game. Lonesome Unicorn is up next. Oh, poor Unicorn. It's 4 and a white for a 3/3 Vigilance. That by itself, not a particularly good card. You do not want to pay 5 mana for a 3/3, and Vigilance isn't exactly worth the extra mana that you're paying either. Thankfully, I think this card is saved by its Adventure Clause, Rider in Need. It's 2 and a white for a sorcery, and it makes a 2/2 Knight creature token with Vigilance. So you're paying 3 mana for a 2/2 Vigilance, which is a little overcosted, and you're paying 5 mana for a 3/3 Vigilance, which again is overcosted. Both sides are probably 1 mana more expensive than you want to pay for the thing that you're getting, but I think the fact that you get both of them and that you can curve one into the other over the course of a couple turns means that this is probably just a solid card. It gives you 2 bodies. By the time you've cast this card on turn 3 and turn 5, you've got 2 relevant bodies on board. One of them's at night, which might matter as well. And it's not like you ever have to cast the Unicorn either, right? If a Knight is good enough for your deck, if a 3 mana 2/2 Knight is something that you're interested in, then sure, the Lonesome Unicorn is actually a nice little bonus on top of that. The card is obviously not great, right? Excuse me. But it is going to fill your needs in a white deck. And I did mention that some white cards care about you having multiple bodies on board, and the more you can get out of a single card, the better. This is one of those cards that can do it, even though it's not the best rate at doing so. Flutter Fox is up next. 1 and a white for a 2/2. It's a fox, obviously, and it's a common. It says, as long as you control an artifact or enchantment, Flutter Fox has flying. So I actually like this just a tiny nod more than Youthful Knight, because flying is better than first strike the majority of the time, not always, but if you're looking to beat down, you probably want flyers more than you want first strikers. Flutterfox takes a little bit of work, of course. It doesn't just have flying. You have to have some sort of artifact or enchantment, and then it just becomes a flyer, but a 2-mana 2/2 flyer is very good. So if you can play a Flutterfox and then turn 3, maybe stick some sort of equipment, some sort of relevant artifact or enchantment on the board, Flutterfox is going to be quite nice. And it's a good target for auras and equipment by itself, since it'll gain flying in addition to whatever you're already putting on it. So Flutterfox, quite nice. I think it's going to be one of the better 2-drops in white here. Fairy Guidemother is up next. A single white mana for a 1/1 flyer. All right, well, I gripe about cards like this a lot. It's a common fairy, by the way. I'm not super excited about that card, right? I don't want to play a 1/1 flyer in any deck, no matter how aggressive, right? This isn't Fairy Miscreant. It doesn't have upside. It just is a 1-mana 1/1 flyer. Thankfully, Fairy Guidemother has an adventure attached to it. Gift of the Fae is 1 and a white. It's a sorcery, and it says target creature gets +2/+1 and gains flying until end of turn. Now, this is one of the adventures where I actually probably almost always want to cast the adventure first and then the creature. I don't want to play this card on turn 1. I want to play it on turn 3 to get in a bunch of extra damage with my creature, make it so that my opponent can't block it, and it gets more damage in, right? Imagine you play a 2/2 on turn 2. Well, you play a Flutterfox. I don't know. Your opponent plays a 2/2 or a 3/3. You can't really attack without offering a trade or having to use some sort of combat trick, well, on your turn 3, you can play the Guide Mother, give your Flutterfox +2/+1, get in for 4 damage, your opponent can't block it, and you can still cast the Guide Mother from exile. This is also one of the cheaper adventure creatures, which matters a lot when it comes to the adventure payoffs, which we'll see some of later on down the line, especially when we get to the green side. So yeah, overall, I think if you're going sorcery half, adventure half into creature, that this is a fine card. If you're just casting it as a creature and you never get the adventure half off, I think this is a pretty bad card. But overall, I think the combination of abilities, if you play this as just a way to get an extra damage followed up by a small minor body on board, this will be a fine card. Bartered Cow is up next. 3 and a white for a 3/3. It's a common ox, and when it dies or when you discard it, create a food token. So this isn't a madness set, right? You're not going to be discarding cards that often. There are a few ways to. Your opponent might mind rot you or something along those lines, but for the most part, this is a hill giant that gives you a food token when it dies. Appropriately, it's a cow, get it? This card, not exactly great, but a 3/3 does affect the board, and 4 mana is not what you want to pay for a 3/3, but Hill Giants have an effect on the board, and sure, gaining the life back or getting the food token matters. It's very similar to the enchantment that we mentioned at the beginning of the video that gives you a food when it comes into play. That's just going to be better with black decks or with green decks if you have the cards in those colors that care about having food tokens. If you don't, this is a Hill Giant with a minor upside. It basically gains you 3 life when it dies. Puts an artifact on board too, which matters for some of these cards, but not a super high pick, not something that should go last pick either. I think it's just a solid playable. Shepherd of the Flock is up next. 1 and a white for a 3/1 human peasant. It's an uncommon 2 mana 3/1. That by itself would not be a particularly exciting card, right? An aggressive deck would really want it. 2 mana 3/1s are fine, even though they get punished by a lot of different things like tokens and things of that nature. But the real upside here, and the reason I don't think this is just like a bust kind of run-of-the-mill card, is that Usher to Safety seems good in this set. It's white mana, it's the adventure half, it's an instant, and it says return target permanent you control to its owner's hand. Okay, so first off, I think effects like that tend to be a little bit better than people give them credit for. If that's all it did, if it was just an instant that bounced one of your own things back to your hand, it wouldn't be a particularly playable card, although there would be times where it'd be quite good, right? If your opponent puts an enchantment on one of your creatures and stops it from attacking or blocking, you bounce it back to your hand, you get to replay it. If your opponent tries to blow you out in combat by using a removal spell, you can save your guy, stuff like that, right? That effect comes up relevantly pretty often, I would say, but isn't really worth a card in your deck. However, Shepherd of the Flock gives you a 3/1 attached to that, so if you don't need a 3/1 on board right away, if it's not attacking, if your opponent's going to just trade off, then you can use this as a combat trick. Not necessarily a combat trick, but a way to save one of your creatures for something detrimental, and then you get a 3/1 out of the deal later on for a pretty cheap price. This also has the added benefit of being really good with other adventure creatures, because if you bounce an adventure creature back to your hand, you have the option to recast the adventure half again, and then cast the creature side from exile, so you get to kind of double up on your adventure creatures by bouncing back to your hand, and Shepherd of the Flock gives you a way to do that. Again, not a busted card. It kind of really only makes sense if you have creatures that work with it. Just using it and holding on to it forever to usher to safety is not exactly a winning strategy, but if you know you're playing against a deck that has a lot of removal, a lot of pacifism type effects, or if you're playing a deck that has a bunch of adventure creatures, then I think this is going to be a solid card, and it's clearly uncommon for a reason. There's no way a 2 mana 3/1 would be uncommon if it wasn't relevant in the format. Rally for the Throne is up next. 2 and a white for an uncommon instant. Create 2 1/1 white human creature tokens. So raise the alarms for 1 extra mana. You have an adamant bonus, though. If at least 3 white mana was cast or spent to cast this spell, you gain 1 life for each creature you control. So 3 mana raise the alarms, not super excited. I'm not actually even excited for 2 mana raise the alarms, but there are decks that care about having multiple bodies and having multiple tokens on board and stuff like that. So if this was 3 mana for raise the alarms, it would be kind of filler category card. The fact that this gains you 1 life for each creature you control means that sometimes against an aggro deck, you'll play this, you'll get 2 1/1s that might be able to trade off for something or chump block something, and you'll just gain 4 or 5 life, and that is a relevant swing against aggressive decks. On its own, not super great. 1/1s aren't that impactful. There's not a lot of ways to augment or go wide with 1/1s, but it's something, right? If you're not getting the adamant bonus, this card's quite bad, right? So you need to be heavy on white, and you need to kind of position yourself to be able to cast this. Sometimes on turn 3, you don't have 3 white mana. You have 2 white mana and your other color, which is red or something like that. So you shouldn't expect to get the adamant every single time. And if you can't expect to get it every time, this card's not going to be great every time. But there are times where you'll have 3 white, you'll cast this, you'll gain enough life to stabilize, and the 1/1s can kind of gang block something else. So I think this card's fine. I think it's very weak for an uncommon overall, but there is some power against aggressive decks here. Worthy Knight is up next. It's 1 and a white for a rare. It's a human knight. It's a 2/2, and it says whenever you cast a knight spell, create a 1/1 white human creature token. So a little bit of a riff on Hero of Precinct 1 from Guilds of Ravnica, Ravnica Allegiance, the 2/2 that gave you a 1/1 token whenever you cast a multicolor spell. I think that one was a little bit easier to get going. Worthy Knight, I don't know how many knights you're going to be able to get in a deck, right? There are a lot of knights. They're spread out across 3 colors. There's a couple more in the other colors. But Worthy Knight on its own is a 2-mana 2/2, and it shouldn't be too hard to get at least 1 or 2 human tokens. I just said Rally for the Throne, or with that card, that 1/1s don't impact the board that much, but a mass of them do. And if you can somehow create 3+ knights off of, or 3+ humans off of this Worthy Knight, it's going to be a pretty good card, even though I don't think it's super splashy, and it's not exactly a reason to go in on knights, right? You still need a way to turn a bunch of 1/1s into an advantage, and Worthy Knight by itself doesn't do that. It just makes the 1/1. So solid bear here with a pretty real upside, but not a powerhouse card. Linden, the Steadfast Queen, is white, 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 triple white for a 3/3 rare legendary human noble. It has vigilance, and whenever a white creature, including itself, attacks, whenever a white creature you control attacks, you gain 1 life. So this counts itself, obviously. It's a 3/3 vigilance for 3, which attacks and gains a life, and gives you additional life whenever your other white creatures attack. That's a pretty good ability, and 3 mana 3/3 is strong, but this gets a bump away from strong or bomb status simply because it's triple white, right? You're not going to be able to cast this on turn 3 that often. I don't think you're playing monocolored decks in this format. It's possible. There are some payoffs. There's adamant cards. There are these triple color early game knights and stuff like that, but I don't think you're supposed to be a monocolored deck that often. You just lose out on too much. That's a topic for another time. So overall, I think Linden is a strong card if you're going to be able to cast it, although if you don't cast it on turn 3, it loses a little bit of its appeal. It's worth noting that Linden herself does not actually have to attack, just has to be on the battlefield. So you can send other white creatures in, and this does swing a race in your favor. Obviously, very strong effect, pretty decent body on her own, but not something that you're going to be able to curve into every single time. All right, and that brings us to what's starting to be the more exciting cards, the high power level cards. These are ones that you do pick up early. You're actually very excited when they wheel or when you get them a little bit later in the pack. Not the bombiest of bombs, but cards that you're actively looking for, and usually the best cards within the color. First up is Trapped in the Tower. It's 1 and a white for a common aura. Enchant a creature without flying, and that creature can't attack, block, or use its activated abilities. So pacifism, but it doesn't work on flyers, and it does stop activated abilities. So I guess more of an arrest that doesn't work on flyers. This is still a very good card. Obviously, a lot of times flyers are the things you want to use your removal spells on, but you can't have everything, right? This isn't actual pacifism, but it has the added upside of being able to lock down a utility creature if there's something on board that's just kind of messing up your plans, but isn't directly engaging in combat. I'll be honest, not being able to enchant a flyer is a downside, so this isn't just your slam, first pick, pacifism type effect, but it'll do the job most of the time, and it is going to be probably White's best removal spell when it comes to commons. Next up is Ardenvale Tactician. 1 white white for a 2/3 flyer. It's a common human knight. Knight relevant, flying relevant, pretty decent power and toughness to mana cost, even though double white can mess you up some amount of the time. It also has an adventure on top of it. Dizzy and Swoop is 1 and a white for an instant. Tap up to 2 target creatures. This is very similar to the 2-drop that we mentioned at the beginning of the video. If you have this on turn 3, you probably just want to cast your 2/3 flyer and start attacking, right? Or get your knight value or whatever. You don't want to hold on to this card, tap 2 creatures, and then the turn later cast your Tactician. You'd rather just get the body on board as soon as possible. But it does help you out a little bit when you draw this card later in the game, especially if you're an aggressive deck. Tapping 2 creatures could mean that you get to attack for lethal, right? So that is a relevant ability. It's just not something you would play on its own. You would not play a 2-mana instant that just said tap 2 creatures. That is not good enough, right? It's too situational. But the fact that you always have a solid creature on top of your sometimes lethal swinging game win-in play is pretty nice. And overall for 5 mana, being able to tap 2 of your opponent's creatures, get a good attack in, and then follow up with a decent flyer seems pretty good. I think this is going to be one of the white creatures that you're actively looking for, and you'll play as many as you can get. Ardenvale Paladin, not an exciting card, but a good one. 3 and a white for a 2/5 human knight. It's a common, and it has Adamant. If you pay at least 3 white mana to cast this spell, it enters with a +1/+1 counter on it. So the good old 4 mana 2/5, not a super exciting card. There was Ironclad Crovad from War of the Spark, which was virtually unplayable in that format. But then there was also Wishcoin Crab in Guilds of Ravnica, which was fantastic for whatever reason. Ardenvale Paladin, it remains to be seen whether a 2/5 for 4 is going to be good enough in this set or not. But sometimes you get a 3/6 for 4, and that's definitely a good card. 3/6 for 4 is a lot of beef. It's a good attacker, it's a very good blocker, and this is a knight on top of it. Plus, you've got a little bit of wiggle room. You have turn 4 to get your 3 white mana rather than turn 3, where something like Linden or Rally the Peasants needs it. So I think Ardenvale Paladin is going to be good. I might be pushing it a little bit by saying that it's on par with these other white commons, but if you can reliably cast a 3/6 for 4 on turn 4, that's going to be a pretty good attacker, and it's going to be hard for your opponent to take that creature down. Venerable Knight is up next. This is white mana for a 2/1 uncommon human knight, and when it dies, put a +1/+1 counter on target knight you control. 1 mana 2/1 is a creature type that, or rather a creature that you're going to be excited to play in your aggressive decks in this set. There's a lot of 2/2s and 3/3s floating around, so this is not going to be able to engage in combat all the time, but it does punish slower starts. Creatures like this often get in 2 to 4 to 6 damage before an opponent really gets started, and this gives you a relevant death trigger when you have to trade off anyway. Your opponent can't just take this hit over and over and over again. Eventually they have to block it, and if you can put that +1/+1 counter on, I don't know, an Ardenvale Tactician or some other flying knight or evasive knight, something like a youthful knight, the first striker, 2/1 first striker, then you get a lot of value out of your 1-drop here. So I do think Venerable Knight is a solid addition to the knight decks or any aggressive white deck in the format. Sir Aelin, the Lion's Claw, is 3 white white for a 4/4 uncommon legendary human knight. It has first strike, and when it attacks, other creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Now, it's kind of interesting. This one actually reads like a rare, whereas Linden reads like an uncommon. And this card is, I think, just very, very good. It is very good on defense. A 4/4 first striker is just not getting attacked into except by the biggest of creatures. It just blocks everything, and it attacks extremely well too, while also buffing your other attackers. We saw Inspire and Unicorn in Guilds of Ravnica, and that card was fine. It often traded off. It wasn't amazing, but it was fine, right? A fine way to turn a bunch of smaller creatures into a sizable attack force. Sir Alan does it much better while also protecting himself with first strike and just being a lot stronger. He's a 4/4 for 5, which is fine, right? So he comes down, he blocks the turn that he comes down very well, and then he attacks extremely well. So this is the payoff you're really looking for when it comes to having a board of creatures, and he's uncommon. You can get 1, maybe 2 of these. It's legendary. Don't play 2 of them at the same time, but I think this is going to be a very powerful card. Very first pickable in my eyes. Mysterious Pathfinder, or I'm sorry, not Pathfinder. Mysterious Pathlighter is up next. 2 and a white for a 2/2 flyer. Already a card that I'd be fine playing. A 3 mana 2/2 flyer, Windrake, if you will. Solid, especially if you're the beatdown. I think that's going to be fine. It's uncommon, and it has a little bit of a bonus. Each creature you control that has an adventure enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. So that's kind of a nice bonus. We saw some aggressive adventure creatures in white. In fact, almost all of White's adventures tend to be pretty powerful, aggressive creatures. Giving them an extra +1/+1 counter is a nice little bonus on top of a creature that you're already happy to play. And note that it does say in parentheses, the creature doesn't have to do the adventure first, right? You can just cast it from your hand as a creature, and it'll come in with a +1/+1 counter. Or if you cast it from exile after you already adventured it, it'll still come in with that +1 counter. So nice little bonus. I think even in a deck that doesn't have any adventure creatures, you'd be pretty happy to cast and play your Mysterious Pathlighter. And with a bunch of creatures that have adventures, you're actually actively looking for this card. Glass Casket is up next, 1 and a white. For an uncommon artifact, when it enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls with converted mana cost 3 or less until Glass Casket leaves the battlefield. If you played, I believe, Dragons of Tarkir, maybe Khans of Tarkir, and you played the card Silk Wrap, this is the exact same thing. It's just an artifact instead of an enchantment. So it's kind of interesting. It's got an enchantment-like ability. We're used to seeing this on things like Oblivion Ring and, Prison Realm being a recent one and stuff like that, but not normally on artifacts. It's here for flavor reasons, really. But it's nice. It takes out a small creature or an early problematic creature, gets it out of the way. There are times where your opponent's going to be able to get that card back, and that can be very problematic. But for the most part, this is a cheap removal spell that deals with something early in the game, which is exactly what aggressive and control decks are looking for. I don't know that there are going to be a lot of white control decks, but there's clearly going to be a lot of white aggro decks, and Glass Casket is going to be a premium removal spell for those decks, while also being an artifact for the decks that care about that. Archon of Absolution, I already hate this card. I don't know why they keep printing protection on these creatures recently, but it's here, so we're going to evaluate it for what it's worth. It's 3 and a white for a 3/2 uncommon flyer. It's an Archon. Already a pretty relevant card. An aggressive white deck will play a Snap and Drake, and this is just a good flyer as it is. It has protection from white for some reason. I don't know exactly why, so if you're playing against a fellow white deck, you just get to completely hose them with this card. It blocks and eats things, or it attacks through them. There's not a lot they can do about it. It's just kind of a nasty card in general. And then it has additional upside. Creatures can't attack you or a planeswalker you control unless your opponent pays 1 mana for each of those creatures. So this is a Snap and Drake, 3 mana or 4 mana 3/2 flyer with double upside. Protection from white being actually a very strong upside. It can't be sniped down by cards like the white removal spell. It can't be hit by Glass Casket, so on and so forth. Also worth noting, it can't be equipped by white equipment, which could be very relevant in this set, but just a minor little thing that's worth noting. Yeah, this card is good. I'd be happy to pick it up pretty early on. The protection from white might not matter in some matchups if your opponent's not playing white. It's kind of a dud of an ability, but the taxation effect is also decent too. That just means your opponent can't alpha strike you and develop their board during the same turn. They kind of have to pick and choose. We saw that with Baird from Dominaria last year, and that was a fine ability on that creature. I think Archon is better than Baird, and that's saying quite a bit. Baird was a fine card. Charmin Prince is up next, 1 and a white for a 2/2 rare human noble. When it enters the battlefield, choose 1. Scry 2, gain 3 life, or exile a creature you own and return it to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. So you can either scry 2 or gain 3 life, which are just minor upsides on top of a 2/2, both relevant upsides, and the flexibility is quite nice. Or you can blink another one of your creatures. Not sure how much that matters. There are some ETB effects, but as we mentioned earlier, this isn't a set that's really based on ETB effects. And for all this, you're still getting a 2 mana 2/2, right? This is not as strong or as situational as something like a Knight of Autumn, but it's going to be just good, right? You're always going to get something on top of your ability, and even though the body you get left behind with isn't super aggressive and doesn't block particularly well, it's still a body, it's still an early play. The Scry 2 is going to come up very relevantly in early game plays. The gain 3 life is going to be relevant against aggro decks and against people who are just trying to kill you as quick as possible. And the exile effect will probably come up too, especially against pacifism type effects and things of that nature. So Charm and Prince is a card that I'm happy to take very early on. I will first pick this over most removal spells because it is just very flexible in what it does. And I think it'll play out very well regardless of which mode you end up using. Acclaimed Contender is up next. 2 and a white for a rare 3/3 human knight. When it enters the battlefield, if you control another knight, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a knight, an aura, an equipment, or a legendary artifact from among them and put it in your hand. The rest go to the bottom in a random order. So 3 mana, 3/3, already a solid body. It does require that you have another knight already on the battlefield before you get this effect. But if you do, looking at the top 5 cards and getting to reveal one of them, if it's one of these cards, it could matter. You do need a high density of knights and or equipment for this to matter, since you're probably not playing a bunch of auras. And if for some reason you have a legendary artifact, then, congratulations, you get to dig a little bit deeper for that too. Even if this misses, and that will feel bad, you still get a 3 mana 3/3 with a relevant creature type. You do have to put in work though, right? Being able to curve Knight into this on turn 3 is not always going to happen. Sometimes it's right to just play your Contender as a 3 mana 3/3 and just forget that you get the ability there. But and it is worth noting that you can brick on this, and that doesn't feel great either. But again, the fail-safe or the fail case, the 4, if you will, being a 3 mana 3/3 with a relevant creature type is not bad. So I think you're taking this card pretty highly. I would be happy to first pick it and then try and draft these sorts of cards much higher. I would prioritize knights and equipment before legendary artifacts and auras, but that's just me. I think this card is quite fine. And that brings us into our bombs, where we're actually going to see all of the mythics from white here on top of a giant killer. This is white mana, single white mana for a 1/2 human peasant. It's a rare. For 1 and a white mana, you can tap it to tap target creature. So just a tapper. It's a little bit expensive, right? 2 mana to tap a creature is not something you can just hold up every single time, but there's no restriction on what this can tap. And we just don't get tappers like this. We saw Wall-Rune Enforcer in War of the Spark, and that card was very good. Giant Killer is, I think, a little bit better than that. Maybe a little bit worse. If it didn't have the adventure, of course. But it does have an adventure, Chop Down. It's 2 and a white for an instant. Destroy target creature with power 4 or greater. So this is just all around a great little utility creature. Either you have an early game tapper to kind of get damage in, or, just mess with the board a little bit so that your creatures are more relevant, or you have a removal spell for a big creature, which white decks tend to have a little bit of trouble with, especially if you're aggressive. Your opponent usually stops you with some big chunky creature, and the Smite the Monstrous ability on the adventure is very nice here. Also just a very cheap creature to cast for the adventure half, right? For 4 mana, you get to blow up a big creature and get a tapper on board. That's very good. So even though I don't think this card looks like a bomb, I think it's going to play out extremely well. You're just going to sometimes have your big, beefy, red-green creature deck, and your opponent's going to kill one of them with the first half and then put the tapper on board and start tapping your other creatures, and it's going to feel like you fall behind very quickly. This can also play in aggressive or defensive decks very, very well. And sometimes you just run it out on turn 1 and you just start tapping things. That's fine too. I think this card is very good. Not quite as strong as some of the mythics we're going to see, but very good on its own. The first mythic is the Circle of Loyalty. Each color has a legendary artifact that has a spell reduction cost based on the certain number of something that you have. In this case, the spell costs 1 less to cast for each knight you control. So for white, it costs 1 less for each knight you control. So you could theoretically get it down to white, but a lot of times this will cost 4 or 5 mana. Sometimes it just costs 6 mana, but that's fine too. It's a legendary artifact, and it gives all of your creatures +1/+1. So right there, you're getting an Anthem. It also says whenever you cast a legendary spell, create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance. Not sure how often that's going to happen. There are uncommon legendaries, but you're still not going to have a ton of them, right? This isn't Dominaria. You're not just going to have 3, 4, 5 legendaries in every single set. So I'm not sure if that's going to always come up, but you might have a couple ways to trigger it. And then it has a tap ability for 3 and a white. You can tap it and create a 2/2 white knight with vigilance. So on its own, it can start pumping out creatures. It is a tap ability, so you only get to do it once per turn. But remember that those creatures get +1/+1, so you're actually pumping out 3/3s. I think this card is fantastic, especially if you happen to be playing a night deck and you can cast it earlier than turn 6. But if this didn't even have that ability and I could just pay 6 mana to then for the rest of the game pay 4 mana and pump out 3/3s while also buffing the rest of my board, I think I'd be quite happy with that. Obviously, you want to prioritize knights higher if you start off with this card, but you should certainly start off with this card regardless, and I can't see any reason a white deck wouldn't play this card. Even the most aggressive white decks would take the Anthem plus Mana Sink ability. Next up is Realm Cloaked Giant. 5 white for a 7/7 vigilance. It's a mythic giant. Okay, that would already be a head scratcher, right? A 7/7 vigilance at mythic rare with no abilities. Definitely a head scratcher. But thankfully, there's an adventure attached to it, which you're going to see a lot. Cast Off is 3 white for a sorcery. Destroy all non-giant creatures. And that means creatures that aren't giants, not just big creatures. Realm Cloak Giant seems like an A+ to me. It's going to come down. It's going to blow up basically everything. There are a few giants in the set. There are times that it's not going to kill your opponent's creature, but there are also times it's not going to kill one of your creatures if they happen to be a giant. But for the most part, this is going to kill everything on board for 5 mana. So 5 mana sweeper, I'm usually pretty happy with that in limited. I like having access to a reset button, not the recess button. And on top of that, you later then get to cast a 7/7 Vigilance, which again isn't the most board-breaking creature that we've ever seen, right? It doesn't have evasion. Vigilance isn't exactly amazing, but it is good on big creatures, and a 7/7 is a big creature. But you've got to imagine the scenarios where you get to wipe the board, and then you get to play this, and it's just going to be the most dominant thing on board, right? If this was just the Wrath ability, I would probably rate it 1 category lower, but the fact that it's a Wrath ability with a very relevant creature tacked onto it, a potential win con for your deck, I think that pushes it up into bomb territory, and I'm recommending playing this card every single time. And that brings us to the last one, which is also the weirdest one on this list, Harmonious Archon. It's 4 white, 6 mana total for a 4/5 Mythic Archon. It has flying, so 6 mana 4/5 flyer, that would be a pretty strong card, even though not a bomb on its own. It says non-Archon creatures have base power and toughness 3/3. So besides this and the pro-white creature that we just saw, I don't think there are any other Archons in the set. So this is going to make everything else except for this a 3/3 on board. Base power and toughness too, right? They might be a little bit bigger. It also says, when Harmonious Archon enters the battlefield, create 2 1/1 white human creature tokens. Keep in mind that those 1/1s will actually be 3/3s as long as the Harmonious Archon is on board. This is a very, very strange card, and I do think it's extremely powerful because what you get for your 6 mana is a total of 10 power and 11 toughness, and that's a lot for 6 mana. Those 3/3s are going to come in there, and the Harmonious Archon is often probably just going to sit back on defense and block your opponent's 3/3s because this does affect your opponent's creatures as well. So the board will look like Harmonious Archon, and then everything else on the board will be 3/3. So everything essentially trades with everything else, while the Archon just kind of sits there and blocks the opponent's creatures. Very strange, right? Obviously good if you can blink it. Obviously very good if you can make a bunch of small creatures, which we've seen some ways to do. This is an effect that you're happy to take first, and then you prioritize as much token generation and creature generation as you can. And also note that this only affects the creature's power and toughness, right? They still have abilities. They still have things like First Strike. They still have fly-in. They still have, protection from white. Well, not that one. But they have all of their abilities. They just change power and toughness. So everything's kind of equal with the exception of the Archon, and the Archon kind of breaks the stall by making it hard for your opponent to attack into you, while you can just send your creatures in and give your opponent the choice as to whether or not they're going to trade. And sometimes you just end up with a bunch more creatures than your opponent, and you can overrun them, right? They get to trade for whatever they want, but everything else is dealing 3 damage. So I think this card is quite strong, and you should first pick it, but there are times where you can't even cast it because it gives your opponent a bunch of 3/3s where they might have had a bunch of 1/1s or 2/2s instead, and you just don't have enough creatures on board. I do think this card's amazing. I think all of the mythics for white are good, and I do think overall white looks like a strong color. It's very focused on the adventures and a very aggressive deck. There's a little bit of artifact, enchantment, matter stuff, but overall that's kind of like the blue-white theme, and we'll see a lot more of that in blue. White seems like a good support color with strong bombs and decent control options, but not a lot of removal and not a lot of late game relevant cards. So that's kind of my take on white here, and that's going to go ahead and bring us to a close. We will look at blue next time, going in Wooburg order, and we'll see some pretty sweet stuff there. So thanks for watching. Remember that you can subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of these videos, and stay tuned for more reviews from Throne of Eldraine. Feel free to comment below if I missed anything, if you want to agree or disagree with anything that's been said, or if you want to tell me about any experiences you have with Eldraine after the set drops. And find us on Twitter at MTG_Manarox. So thanks for joining us. My name's Timothy here with Manarox. Now I'll see you.